We're thrilled to have in the studio Mark Honigsbaum, who's someone I've admired for a long time. He's an acclaimed medical historian and author of a book, great book, The Pandemic Century, which, like Mark himself, helped me enormously during the pandemic to understand from my dopey starting point what was going on. Right. And I know a lot of other journalists felt the same, but he was, there is really no greater authority on the history of pandemics and what they mean. So welcome to you, Mark. We asked to have you offer us some thoughts because obviously there's a lot going on in this country, but also we're keeping an eye on what's going on the other side of the Atlantic. And one of the things that naturally has concerned us was the nomination of Robert F Kennedy Jr. to be Secretary for Health and Human Services. So before we get stuck into what that might mean for the US and for the world, should we have a quick clip showing how slippery RFK can be?
Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
I think some of the live virus vaccines are probably averting more problems than they're causing. There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
Those are big words.
What I was actually saying in that interview, and what I've said for 20 years, is that there is no such thing as a vaccine that is safe and effective for everyone.
He's very much in the populist mold of I'm just asking questions. Mm-hmm. Can you, Mark, give us, for those who don't necessarily follow these things in detail, a summary of what RFK's beliefs are on vaccines and why they matter?
Okay, so it's complicated because he says one thing in one interview and another thing in another interview, especially when confronted by more serious journalists or when he's trying to present himself as someone who perhaps isn't, as big a threat to public health as many people believe he will be. So as I understand his position, he's not an out-and-out anti-vaxxer in that he does seem to support vaccines. Indeed, he's claimed repeatedly that all his children have had vaccines. Albeit he doesn't say, have they had, the full recommended schedule?
Yes.
Did they have, the 3-in-1 measles, mumps, rubella jab?
MMR,
did they space them out? So we don't really know what he means by that. But sort of taking a deep... So I think, you can judge him by what he says, which is complicated, and he has nuanced positions on some vaccines. I think his essential position is he questions the efficacy of some vaccines, but he's more focused on the safety issues. And of course, this all goes back to autism, Andrew Wakefield.
Andrew Wakefield's discredited
Lancet
paper.
Who's Andrew Wakefield, just to remind people?
Okay, so Andrew Wakefield was the gastroenterologist who did a study at the Royal Free Hospital, purporting to show from a series of 12 case studies that children who came to him with gastroenterital problems went on to develop autism. It was just 12 cases, it was anecdotal reports. Unfortunately, it was published by The Lancet, and that gave birth to the whole anti-vax conspiracy movement. So when we talk about RFK, we're actually talking about a problem we exported to the US.
And we exported Wakefield as well, didn't we? Because he's gone to America and been very successful.
Yeah, so Wakefield has thrived in the same anti-vaccine networks that have had huge amount of money pumped into them over the last 10, 15, 20 years, but particularly during COVID. We'll come back to that maybe if we want to circle back a little bit. But the other source of Robert F. Kennedy's skepticism about vaccines goes back to his period as a campaigning environmental lawyer. So, if you go back to the 70s, 80s, he did represent people, very famously campaigned for clean water in the Hudson Valley. But that led into all these conspiracy theories about mercury poisoning. So mercury is a problem, especially if in Japan they had a huge mercury poisoning issue because of all the mercury in fish and tuna and stuff like that. But that led Robert F. Kennedy down a rabbit hole into the minute traces of mercury that are used as preservatives in vaccines, right? So it's a good idea to have a preservative in vaccine in case, the needle's not totally sterile and you give someone, a bacterial infection when you inoculate them. But he leapt on that as evidence that babies were being brain damaged by these minute traces of thimerosal in vaccines.
Thimerosal is a product of mercury, is it?
Well, so this way it gets a bit complicated because it's very different with the mercury that is in the environment. So mercury is all around us. We're always touching things with mercury. They're in everything. They're particularly high levels in fish. And there are recommended levels which you should not go above. Thimerosal is not the same as that kind of mercury. I believe it's an ethyl mercury. It breaks down much more rapidly in the body.
Right.
But it's true, there were concerns from scientists that, and they looked into it. They did a deep dive, could he be right? Could there be too much thimerosal? At the same time he flagged it, the CDC actually removed thimerosal from vaccines. This is why my real problem with Robert F Kennedy is he's a weird mixture of pseudoscience, but he presents himself as a consumer champion, but he's not an honest narrator. Because at the time he was scaring people about thimerosal, they removed them from vaccines. It was not an issue.
Right.
So before the 2016 election, when Trump was elected president, he promised RFK Jr. That he would be head of some sort of campaign or commission to examine vaccine safety. And that fell by the wayside. Obviously, someone whispered in Trump's ear. Cut to post-COVID 2024. And RFK Jr. is now, set to be, if he's confirmed by the Senate, the most powerful health official in the United States, and therefore, by extension, have massive influence over the world and its health policy. Tell us, Mark, how COVID shifted the argument.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Just back up one stage. I mean, to go back to your question of why Trump may be sidelined with 20. Well, I think one good thing Trump did during COVID was Operation Warp Speed, where he basically, put up a huge amount of federal funding to fast track, to basically underwrite the research the vaccine companies need to do really quickly to fast track these vaccines. Presumably he did that because someone said, look, you've got to take this seriously. It could tank the economy, could affect the stock market. You could go down as a president So he was sensible enough. Boris Johnson did a similar thing here. For all his pandemic denial, his lockdown, he did get that, science could deliver us from this terrible. What happens during COVID, of course, though, is it becomes the lockdowns, the mask wearing, all these things become hugely unpopular with libertarians, particularly on the right, also on the left. And the whole thing shifts. But what it allows Robert F. Kennedy to do is, from his ideas being fringe and not being part of the mainstream, suddenly all those ideas about anti-vaccination, about the role of big pharma in poisoning our children, get a huge sort of boost, and a lot more money pours in to the Children's Defense Fund.
Which is his fund.
So basically, what you have to understand is that for 10 years or more, ever since he hooked up with Andrew Wakefield, he has this, not just a website, it also has its own closed cable television program where he and his sort of pseudo-scientific friends, he's got doctors and supposed virologists, and they all do deep dives. What they do is they go down the rabbit hole, right? And they look up, the data on vaccine studies. And they pick it apart. And we saw a lot of this during COVID. People taking statistics and cherry picking facts in order to claim COVID isn't that big a threat, questioning the excess deaths, going down the list of people who died from COVID and saying, well, this person got underlying health, this person. So it's not a big threat if you're healthy. If you're a big, healthy, fit guy like Robert F. Kennedy who likes to surf, we know he likes to eat weird food. He's once photographed.
He's a gym bunny as well, isn't he?
Well, you see that he's this weird mishmash of pseudoscience but sort of new age philosophy.
Yes.
Of course, he's married to Cheryl Hines, the actress
who Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Yeah, so you kind of think, well, he can't be that bad if he's married to Cheryl. He surfs. Well, that's quite a cool thing to do. He's into psychedelics.
He's a Kennedy.
And he's a Kennedy.
He's a Kennedy. Exactly. He's got the name recognition and all that. And to be fair, he probably got led down the rabbit hole because of all the conspiracy theories surrounding, the assassination of his uncle.
That's fascinating. Do you think so? Is there a sense of that
Well, I don't
He's bought
think.
into
I think,
that.
given his upbringing and the strain, you could not but help be a conspiracy theorist.
yeah.
I think
given how many Kennedys have died. And
he has said that he believes the CIA killed both his father and his uncle.
Wow,
So, you know,
wow.
but Mark, tell us. I mean, what if he's confirmed? What does that mean for vaccine policy in the US and research, and what does it also mean? Because I think, you know, it's easy to underestimate the might of American health policy and pharma. What might it mean for the wider world?
Right. So the core of Robert Kennedy's criticism of the pharma industry and the FDA, the Federal Drug Agency that regulates vaccines, is that he, unlike every other drug that's developed, so, you know, a vaccine is different from a medical pharmaceutical drug in that it's known as a biologic. Why is it called a biologic? Because vaccines contain viruses, which are actual natural products. They're not, you know, the pharmaceutical industry doesn't make the viruses that they then attenuate going into vaccines. I mean, one of the thing that people don't understand is that, you know, vaccines are developed and they've won public confidence over hundreds of years, right? The first vaccine goes back to 1786 with smallpox.
And just interestingly, this is the one thing I know about vaccines is because they were injected with cowpox, right? Which is why it's called vaccine, from the Latin for cow.
Yes, vacca for
vacca
cow.
for cow. Yeah.
So the point I'm trying to make is that you know, vaccinology is the ultimate applied empirical science. What I mean by that is that people have worked out that certain things, like, and the classic example is the smallpox virus. So what Jenner did is he observed that milkmaids, unlike the rest of the population, didn't seem to get smallpox. And he hypothesized that was because it's well known that milkmaids got exposed to the cow version, and that gave them immunity against smallpox. So working on the basis of inference, he inferred, well, if that protects them, what if I take some pustules from someone who's cowpox and put them under the skin of someone who, and I can use that to inoculate them. Jenner didn't know how or why that was effective. He just knew from empirical observation that it worked.
Yeah.
But this is true of many vaccines. We do not know exactly what the pathophysiology, the actual causal mechanism is that results in a certain vaccine protecting you against the disease. But we know from trial and error and doing enough studies that statistically, if you give someone a vaccine before the age of 4, a child, they will not go on to develop measles, right? Of course, we don't have 100% immunity against all diseases that vaccinated against, but measles is a very good example. And we also know that if you put certain substances in vaccines, which are known as adjuvants, right? An adjuvant, the typical adjuvant is aluminium salts. These are substances that boost your body's response to the inoculation. So it helps your body recognize that there's an antigen being inserted into your muscle, and it recruits all the immune cells to go to flood that injection site, and that kickstarts the immune response.
Right.
But that's also been a matter of trial and error. So he starts attacking thimerosal, first of all. Confusing, that's not an adjuvant, it's actually a preservative that was put in vaccines. But he has questioned, you know, aluminium salts, which are the standard adjuvant used in vaccines. And his big beef is that, unlike other pharmaceutical products, they haven't been subjected to safety studies that take place over years and years and years. But this is where he's an unreliable narrator, you see, because basically when someone sets out to study any vaccine, this was true of COVID, you know, even though it can usually take 5 to 10 years to develop a vaccine, and you have all sorts of studies of phase 1, which is the safety study, where first of all they give the vaccine to animals and check that it's not so toxic, the animals, the mice, or if you're using, you know, rabbits, fall dead, then it's safe to give them to volunteers. Typically, a pre-safety authorization study will usually involve no more than 100 volunteers. So what they're looking for is that nobody gets some sudden, you know, mortal reaction to the vaccine. But of course, that's a very, very small sample. his beef is, and I've watched hundreds of videos like this, is where he puts up a sort of table with, standard like antibiotics or things like Xanax or Prozac, and shows how many years there were of safety studies. And then on the other side, he says, look at all these vaccines. They only studied them for 4 or 5 days. That's true if you just talk about phase 1. What he doesn't go on to say is that through all the next rigorous and highly controlled studies, they recruit more and more patients. So during COVID, for instance, thousands of people in this country participated in experimental trials of these COVID vaccines. I took one. One was Novavax. I had to go repeatedly, long before anyone got the shots on the NHS, and enroll in a trial. And of course, all the while they're monitoring whether that protects you against the pathogen, but they're also collecting safety data.
Right.
The problem becomes when you roll out of vaccines, so as we did during the pandemic or as we do with MMR, and virtually the whole population gets them. Then you do see these rare adverse events. And this has become the whole focus of these campaigns because it's very, very emotive. Often involves mothers whose children have had what they claim is an adverse reaction, neuropathic reaction, or in extreme cases they claim that autism was triggered by the measles vaccine. And statistically, it just isn't borne out. And there's been hundreds of studies showing that there is no causal connection, or not one that's been demonstrated so far. Yet he continues to parrot the same thing. And as you said at the beginning, Max, ask questions, right? So to come back to what he's going to do is, he said this is from October, 25th of October. So he told us exactly what he's going to do. This is what he said. The FDA's war on public health is about to end. This includes its aggressive suppression of, and a long list comes along, psychedelics, peptides, stem cells, raw milk. I could go on and on. He even say they've suppressed sunshine, clean exercise, and anything else that advances human health, and what can't be patented by big pharma. And then the kicker: if you work for the FDA, the Federal Drug Agency, and are part of this corrupt system, I have 2 messages for you. 1, preserve your records. 2, pack your bags.
Jeez. So a threat, I'm going to sack you and I'm going to sue you.
Yeah, well, this comes, so when he says, preserve your records, he believes, he's been issuing, through his acolytes and his network of, vaccine denialists, they've been bombarding the FDA with freedom of information requests because they believe that they've withheld information during these phase 1 safety studies about cases of brain damage or other adverse events that he thinks they're trying to cover up and hide.
Yeah.
So he's going to have people crawling over all the records and presumably start leaking or publishing selective information that gives a partial view and not the complete picture. But the second really crucial thing, and this is where I think there is some justification in his position. So if you're unfortunate enough to be associated with an adverse event, right, which means that vaccines being rolled out, statistically, most people don't have but a few minority cases, some people, for whatever reason, presumably because of their immune system or their particular genetic disposition, there's something in the vaccine or the adjuvant that turns our immune system either off or turns it into overdrive. So a lot of these neuropathic conditions, these nervous conditions that are linked to the nervous system and brain processes, do seem to be triggered or can be triggered by particles from viruses or the adjuvants. And we know this. So we know that during the 1918 pandemic, when everyone got influenza, there were no vaccines then, right? We can't blame vaccines for anything that happened after influenza. 5 to 7 years later, there was this epidemic of encephalitis lethargica, where people fell asleep. It was immortalized in
Oliver Sacks's book, Awakenings.
Exactly, immortalized because they all woke up later when they were given the right drug.
L-Dopa,
Or to the common man, the Robin Williams, Robert De Niro film.
That's that one, yeah.
Exactly. So the point I'm trying to make is that we do have a system for people who have rarely been affected by what does seem to be a causal relationship, right? Taking the vaccine or whatever, and it's somehow triggering this very rare event. So there are vaccine injury compensation funds. In America, they have one that's set up by the federal government. We have the same version here. His big beef, though, is that unlike every other medical product, the US government, and we do the same thing here, indemnifies vaccine manufacturers against being sued for any, adverse event that follows vaccination. Okay.
And why do they do that then? Just to spell that out,
well,
because of the unknowability of it.
Yeah. So, the reason for that is that vaccine is very, very expensive and time-consuming to develop vaccines. Some vaccines are commercially lucrative. So, for instance, if you're looking at everyone here because we're around the same age as the 60s, if you're an American, you'd be bombarded with adverts for shingles. Get your vaccine against the herpes zoster virus because in old age, as your immune system, you can develop, the pustules from herpes zoster that you would have had inoculated as a kid when you had chickenpox, right?
Yeah.
And there's a very good vaccine for that, and it's highly effective, and it's commercially lucrative. You can sell it to middle-class people through their insurance plans or whatever. That's not true of a pandemic or emergency vaccine that you need rolled out very quickly with no guarantee that the vaccine's going to be effective or that after the pandemic's over, you're going to have a lucrative market, right?
Yeah.
So you have to incentivize vaccine companies. And they simply wouldn't invest all that time and money on such a risky venture if they were going to be sued. But the way we have checks and balances for that is having a very, very tough regulatory regime that subjects them to the highest scientific protocols. And to suggest otherwise is why I say he's not a reliable narrator. But the scary thing is that it seems that what he's targeting is that indemnity. We shouldn't forget he started his career as a litigator, right? At heart, this guy is an ambulance chaser. And we've already said how he's recruited this very effective cadre of, moms.
Warrior
moms, right? Usually whose kids have suffered autism, which is a tragic thing. I have huge sympathy for them. But rather than expending his time on saying, let's really have a proper investigation into what is causing, all these cases of autism, but also how we can treat it. Let's invest money on that, not in going down a rabbit hole and a sidetrack of something that there's no evidence actually does cause autism. But what he wants to do is he wants to sort of unravel that indemnification of vaccine management. So basically, under Reagan, an act was passed in 1986 that allowed, granted this indemnity. And it's been on the books ever since. So, the nightmare scenario for scientists and public health is he gets affirmed by the Senate as the head of Department of Health and Human Sciences. We know that Trump has he has both houses, Senate and they could very easily get through a bill to roll back that indemnity. What would that mean? It would mean the collapse of the vaccine market.
I mean, that's just hearing you say that is astonishing, because at the end of the pandemic, and I remember you saying this to me during the pandemic, which was one of the most important things is that when this ends, or when it winds down, because there are still, let's not forget, new variants of COVID popping up. It's so important that we learn the lessons and that we build up pandemic resilience. Okay, here we are at the end of 2024. And about to enter the Office of Health and Human Services, the very apex, is potentially the biggest force multiplier of, at minimum, vaccine hesitancy that you could put in the world. So, Mark, talk us through what that means for the US and then more broadly about vaccine sharing, the development of vaccines in the light of future pandemics and so on.
Well, I mean, it's very disappointing. You can imagine I'm hugely disappointed having lived this whole period and wrote a book about, the history of pandemics before the COVID pandemic. There were mistakes that were made during COVID, particularly with the public health messaging. You'll probably recall at one point we were told everyone has to get the vaccine, not just, the elderly who might be at risk of serious illness and dying, but everyone, because this vaccine is going to stop us transmitting COVID. Well, that was, Anthony Fauci came out and said that. And I know because from talking to his scientific and medical advisors, that people actively inside in were advising him not to say that. right? Because they said, we don't know that for certain, so you should not be making these statements that all result in us being delivered to this magical thing called herd immunity,
yes.
right? So we know that's not the case with COVID because it mutates so quickly. But without the COVID vaccines, our hospitals would have been overwhelmed,
yes.
right? It was always just about protecting healthcare and the NHS and hospitals. And we will face that issue again if there's another pandemic. If bird flu, which we now know is transmitting sporadically to people, and we know it's mutating constantly, that could trigger the next pandemic. We would then need an emergency influenza vaccine. And we would be right back in all the same debates and questions that we went through with COVID. The difference would be that there'd be a much larger proportion of the population who will be, if you like to twist the metaphor, they would have been inoculated against vaccines by all these conspiracy theories and also, all this pseudoscience.
Vaccine sharing to parts of the world that didn't have the vaccine was patchy at best during the COVID pandemic. I'm guessing that under a sort of Kennedy dispensation, it would be negligible at best.
Yes, I mean, you can imagine under Kennedy, as you say, that first they would not mandate vaccines.
Yes,
Anyway, I think that would be gone. This is also the target now, whether or not we have a next pandemic. The other thing he wants to do is he wants to exercise more control over the CDC.
Which is the...
So the Centre for Disease Control is the agency that is responsible for emergency health interventions, but also vaccines. And they were the one that they recommend vaccines that they say to the states, you should adopt as part of your vaccine schedules. And of course, one of Kennedy's things is he's constantly saying, this list has grown from like 5 or 7 when I was a kid, and now there are more than 50 vaccines on the list. It's simply not true that people are compelled by mandates to have all these vaccines. It's true during COVID that Biden wanted to sort of mandate it for federal employees. But, even schools that require you or ask for you to have vaccines will not actually bar your child from school if you don't come in. It happens very, very rarely. But this is one of his big targets. He wants to roll back all those vaccine mandates and make it optional or up to the individual. It's a classic libertarian position.
But isn't the libertarian position on vaccines essentially bullshit, in the sense that vaccines are only meaningful if you achieve herd immunity levels? So whilst I'm not arguing that people should be forced by policemen to have vaccines, in terms of social norms, the idea that it is normal and right and odd not to, he's saying I'm not going to stop anyone from having a vaccine. Well, that's not what you want a health secretary to say. You want a health secretary to be out there using the bully pulpit saying, for God's sake, get your kids vaccinated. Otherwise we're going to have a measles epidemic.
Exactly. So there's no better example than measles, because we do know that if a child has the 2 shots of the MMR vaccine before the age of 4, they will be inoculated against measles for life. They won't be able to get measles, but they won't be able to transmit it either. So that vaccine does induce true herd immunity. And of course, in 1968, when the US introduced the measles vaccine, up to, I think it was, I can't remember the exact date, but by around the early 2000s, America had been declared measles free by the World Health Organization. And then what did we see shortly before the pandemic in 2018? I recall this vividly. There were outbreaks because of vaccine denialism, and communities like Somalians in Minnesota, but also the Orthodox Jewish community in outside New York, in I think it was I forget the area, but just outside New York. There were huge outbreaks of measles in those communities because vaccination levels had fallen because of hesitancy and lack of confidence. And of course, we've seen the same thing here in the UK, particularly in parts of the inner city, not far from where we're now in Tower Hamlets. Vaccination levels fell very low, also in the Midlands. So this is the big worry, because essentially, if you don't vaccinate and assure herd immunity, you end up spending first of all, kids may die, they may get brain damage, they may be deaf or blind. But also, you're going to spend a huge amount of money on treating these people in the NHS, much more than you would if people just took a vaccine that is cheap to produce and has been proven to be safe for 40 years.
Mark, where are we looking at the macro picture? With COVID, to many of us, although I'm very conscious that there are still people suffering from new variants and stuff, but it feels like it's a past pandemic now. Mm-hmm. What's in the future? I mean, how at risk are we as the world at the next big mass killer pandemic?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, we should be far better prepared because scientists learned an awful lot. So when COVID hit, we did not know, or we did not think it would be possible to produce the vaccines as quickly as we have. But we've got this marvelous new technology, RNA, where influenza vaccines in the old days, you had to incubate them in chicken eggs in these vast factories. And you had to use droppers to remove the antigens. So it was a very laborious, labor-intensive process. We can now make the antigen in a matter of weeks in a laboratory. What takes a long time is proven that you're developing a safe delivery system and testing it and doing all those checks that Kennedy's determined to sort of, unravel, or maybe add even more checks, making it possible. So my fear is that, will vaccine companies in a new regulatory environment that we may have very shortly under Trump be willing to take those risks?
Because the margins are quite small in vaccines, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, so the companies make their money on the back end once, the emergency. Well, I mean, they make money by selling,
the patents.
Selling the vaccine to the government. They buy, they guarantee. It's all about scale, right? If the market's too small, it's not worth it because you're never going to recoup that money at scale. So the government's there to underwrite that investment so it can be rolled out at an affordable price as well. They then make their money on the back end because, we're now in a situation where most people, you can't get the vaccine if you're under 65. You can go to a pharmacy and pay for it. In America, of course, they charge a huge amount. But here you could be charged as much as £100 to get one of the vaccines. Yeah. So that's where they make their money on the back end. And then that's the free market. That's stuff that Republicans, they believe in all that. So, I mean, the worry about the pandemic, of course, is although we should be better prepared, we know you talked about how there was this terrible inequality in the way vaccines were distributed. So that really, where is the next pandemic likely to happen? It could happen in Canada, where we recently had a case of H5N1. It could
bird flu,
H5N1 bird flu. It could happen in USA, but it's more likely most pandemics start in remote developing parts of the world, Asia typically, and those countries have been. They also have huge suspicions. Some of pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
China's a good example of that. If there's another outbreak in China, will the Chinese be as keen to share the genomic sequence of the virus with Western sciences, given the whole all the thing about the lab leak and all the criticism of China and claims that they were responsible? So, that's a big question mark. Is this whole experience going to make it more or less likely that scientists can cooperate across national borders and difficult political regimes? But my much bigger fear, and this is where I really think that scientists and people like Bill Gates have gone wrong, is that the much bigger danger is that vaccine hesitancy and conspiracy theories about vaccines will rapidly spread on social media. And there's nothing that you can say, the governments can say and politicians can say, to really combat that level of distrust, unless you also have a much more serious educational program to inoculate people against conspiracy theories.
It seems to me that the two things, or assuming the technology is there and the supply is there, that you need in a pandemic is social confidence and international collaboration.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that having Robert F Kennedy in that office is likely to chill both, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so one thing I like to mention is, it's easy to look at someone like Robert F Kennedy and say, well, the guy's a crank, he's a bit weird, but he can't really do any harm, can he? But the guy has done immense harm. So, Samoa, but before we get to Samoa, very quickly, he was one of the first people, or one of the most prominent people, to amplify conspiracy theory, pseudoscientific theory, that HIV did not cause AIDS. And of course, Mbeki in South Africa bought into that. Robert F. Kennedy repeated it. So Mbeki hired all sorts of cranks, much like Trump's doing now, who also didn't share that belief, and withdrew antiretroviral therapies and recommended that South Africans take beetroot and other herbal remedies for HIV. It's estimated that over 300,000 people in South Africa died needlessly of HIV.
Unbelievable.
A disease, a virus that you can live with all your life now if you take antiretroviral therapy.
And you can draw a direct line to those 300,000 deaths to the new health secretary of the United States.
Well, yeah, not him alone.
But there is a line there.
He's part of a continuum of
no, he's part. I mean,
misinformation.
Tell us about Samoa.
Well, in the case of Samoa, so in Samoa, like in other parts of the Pacific Island, they rolled out MMR vaccines. But in 2018, I can't remember the exact figures, but in one hospital, one centre where they administered the vaccines, the nurses mixed up the vaccines accidentally with another product. It was a blood
steroid,
product,
I think it was.
Steroid or something, yeah. And as a result of this, some children had terrible reactions and died. Robert F. Kennedy then immediately flew down to Samoa with this woman, I have to say, is because he's surrounded by all these qualified doctors. They're usually MDs who then transition from being a physician to suddenly they're experts on virology and epidemiology. They do deep dives and they come out and be his core advisors. This woman is called Sherry Tenpenny.
Good name.
Very unfortunate because, the obvious pun, you wouldn't give 10 penny for her opinions. But he basically flew down and immediately, so the government withdrew the MMR vaccine as a caution while they investigated. So that already had some impact on, but then he went down and started proselytizing, saying, see, I've been saying all along the MMR is dangerous, don't take it. The result was vaccination levels fell precipitously low. And by 2019, within months, they had a huge outbreak in Samoa, which killed lots of children. I think 50, 60, maybe 70 children were going with exact figures. And that was very widely blamed on Robert F. Kennedy Jr., this woman, Sherry Tenpenny. And another interesting, one of his closest, moms, campaigners for the autism MMR link, is a woman called Polly Tommy, who was featured here by the press several years ago. She came out with, she's a mother, a British mom whose son developed autism. She believes as a result of the jab. She wrote a big book on it. And she now works for Children's Health Defense, Kennedy's prime network. She runs his TV service on that and hosts all these programs where they bring on people like Sherry Tenpenny or Del Bigtree. He's another one. But really the more sinister thing that he's been up to is Children's Defense Fund is a charity, right? So they're not required to disclose the source of their donations. But most of the money, something like $30 million US, they channel through this group called ICANN, which is another, it stands for Informed Choice for Parents or something, hosted by this guy, Del Bigtree, who's a very close associate of Andrew Wakefield. And what they do is they fund this law firm called Syrian Gilstead, which has been bringing lawsuits on behalf of supposedly vaccine-damaged moms against the vaccine companies. And what they're trying to do is get discovery of documents that they say these companies withheld, which would prove they knew the risk and had covered them up.
Wow. And so the guy behind all this, in conclusion, is about to become the head of health policy in the US.
That's right.
It's quite something, isn't it?
It is. It's scary. But just to make one last point, what I find most curious or perplexing or odd about Kennedy. I mean, he's a deeply weird man. Okay, this is a man who apparently wants to make America eat healthy again, right? He's been campaigning against ultra-processed foods. But not so long ago, he was photographed by Vanity Fair, allegedly eating a barbecued Korean dog.
Okay.
So...
and the Big Mac on the, or chicken nuggets on the plane as well. You know.
But that's not the worst bit. Kennedy helpfully explained to Vanity Fair, no, it wasn't a dog, because I would never eat dog. It was actually a Patagonian goat.
Right. Okay.
But
Completely sane and rational, really.
so I mean, so he won't eat Big Mac, but he'll eat like dodgy barbecued meats from the wild.
Amazing.
Maybe have all sorts of bacterial disease. He doesn't mind that. But the other interesting thing is on that long list of things that he was saying he would, all these alternative therapies, he's very keen for some reason on psychedelics.
Right, I was going to ask you about this because I'm fascinated by psychedelics.
Well, this is very big, isn't it, in the manosphere with people like Joe Rogan and so on. They all believe in it.
It's a big with all the techies, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because they're all betting that if they can get the FDA to approve licenses for MDMA and psychedelic mushroom psilocybin, there'll be huge boom times, right? People are already setting up these companies, just the same way we've had cannabis, cannabinoids marketed in different formulations. There's a huge industry waiting out there for microdosing, MDMA, all that. Techies love all that stuff, right?
It's the end of, I don't know if you've watched the great series Industry on the BBC, and the last scene is the young lad, is it Rob, pitching to VCs, get in now, because this is about to take off. Yeah. And I think they're right, aren't they?
Yeah.
It is.
So that's the back end of all this.
I think so. And what's deeply odd about it is the FDA have relaxed the licensing to allow therapeutic trials of MDMA and psilocybin. And, there are medical benefits which are legitimate. So, for instance, not many people know, this could be a whole other podcast, by the way, that psilocybin cures this excruciating condition called a cluster headache, which is 100 times worse than a migraine. Or it seems to, anecdotally. But it's been very hard to do proper safety studies. The problem when people do all these studies of psychedelics or things like MDMA is it's very hard to have a control group that's free of bias, because obviously if you give someone a psychedelic substance, they're going to trip, right?
Yes.
If you give them a placebo, right away they're going to know I haven't had it.
You can't have a double, there's no double blind on... Yeah.
So what they do is they tend to give people like very small doses of the psychedelic, right? But of course, all the people doing the studies are such evangelists for the studies, so they can't help contaminate the results.
Just a final question, Mark, is do you think there's a risk? Because a lot of this people will like the sound of, against ultra-processed food, a more open-minded approach to psychedelics, cracking down on bureaucracy. Yeah. Is the real worry with Kennedy that he'll be quite plausible on lots of things, and he'll be able to use that as a Trojan horse to get through some real horror show policies on vaccination and other things? Yeah, no, exactly. So, I mean, I think my bet would be that, yes, it would play out that way. He will say things that, say, well, yeah, we should try that. Let's give it a go. That sounds sensible. But behind the scenes, by, cutting the amount of staff or employees who are involved in the vaccine trials, publishing documents that most people will not qualify to read or understand, but could undermine vaccine confidence. Or the big one, removing the indemnity for vaccine manufacturers, and that will just play out through the market. So by changing and tweaking certain things, the market will do the rest, right? The market will kill the development pipeline for these products. Well, except for psychedelics. If he does get confirmed, will you come back and tell us how he's doing and what? Yeah, and I'm going to be watching it very carefully. Yes, I bet you will be. It's a fascinating time to do what you do. Be what I do. And it's also a very scary time, I think, for ordinary people, because it's very, very hard to understand the science, absolutely. Very, very hard. Mark, thank you so much. I've learned so much in the last half an hour. I can't tell you. What's the name of the book again?
My book was called The Pandemic Century,
Yeah.
and I have a podcast occasionally called Going Viral, but
Great name for
I
a great
will be
name for the
returning
pod.
to
I
this
like it.
subject.
You put more thought into your podcast title than we did into ours.
Thanks
But
so
thanks for
much.
coming on to the Two
Thank you.
Mats,
Thank
hosted
you.
by
Nice to meet
Two
you
Mats.
both
Thank you.
in person.